great. I will be hopefully a little condensed in this so we can make up a little bit of lost time. Because I think this is where it gets really exciting, which is where are we going? And I think it, to me, all returns back to what do we actually value when we talk about carbon sequestration. Where I think we should head is around a number of key markers to determine whether things are successful. The first is on the economics piece, that we need to figure out how to remove carbon from the atmosphere at less than $100 a ton at very large scale. Very large is on the order of 10 billion tons per year. This has to be done in a way that's robustly verified. We have to make sure that if we're sequestering carbon, we're accurately accounting for the fact that some carbon is much more durable than other carbon. But this is not an impossible challenge. We invest in debt, much of which is much more likely to end up defaulting than other types of debt all the time. So we should be able to figure out how to do this well across the full portfolio of solutions. And we have to figure out how to do this in a way that's not just good for the climate, but it's good for environment and for people. And I think this is often lost in the conversation that carbon sequestration is this kind of technical fix for us not being able to stop the fossil fuel emissions that are causing climate change fast enough. But I think we need to shift that entirely to think about how can we actually develop these projects in a way that creates the economic system of the future that we want, and is one that is not just fundamentally running in reverse, where we're taking carbon from the atmosphere, putting it back into the ground in order to make our economy go, but to do so in a way that addresses a lot of the equity and really inequity in the system that got us to this place today. So the question is, how do we do that, in my mind? And I think the key for how we do that is deployment-led innovation. This is not a new idea, but it's one that seems to work over and over again. This is a great analysis that the Rhodium Group did a couple years ago, which looked at essentially the rates at which technology got installed, measured in years, not in the normal metrics that we look at in terms of scale of deployment. And what we see is solar PV is really amazing in how quickly it took off. The Rhodium Group thinks that direct air capture can essentially not be far behind if we create the right incentives. But the key for the analysis that they did is they said this is not a function of time. It can play out in a quick time scale only if it's a function of investment and deployment today. That what we need is to not just do the research and do that early stage innovation, but start to build projects at scale now. They actually showed that you don't need to build that many projects, all things considered, to radically drive down cost points. First thing that they found is that the technology today, even at that first 1 million ton per year level, is within a fairly affordable range and within spitting distance of many of the incentives that exist in different policy landscapes around the world. The second is that we don't actually have to build that many projects. If you think about a 1 megaton project, we really only need to build a few dozen of them in order to drive down cost reductions at an enormous scale. That said, this is no small feat. We have to figure out how to get deployment and projects in the ground. I also think that that is not going to be sufficient for technology to come down the cost curve as quickly as is needed. That it's simply going to take a long time to build projects for a whole bunch of reasons outside of the technological context. for policy and regulatory reasons, carbon capture projects simply have not happened as quickly as anybody has thought they would. And I think we should approach that, especially on the technological side, with a lot of humility and understand that this process is inherently one that does not move swiftly, at least in the US and Europe. Where I am really excited is about the broader technology ecosystem that continues to move forward, that's not necessarily pointing at carbon sequestration today, but very well could be, and in some cases has started to. That I mentioned earlier, that people are thinking about material science breakthroughs, whether it comes to metal organic frameworks or other types of materials and membranes that could have radical breakthroughs in technology. We're also seeing things like bioengineering that are radically more advanced today than they were 5 years ago. I think some of the biggest advances are in things like CRISPR and other bioengineering approaches that could dramatically increase our ability to engineer biological systems in order to sequester more carbon, whether that's through speeding up the process of perennialization of plants, or figuring out how to modify root systems in order to sequester carbon in soils. This is also a thing that we can advance with microbial fertilizer and additives to soils. I think another key piece of that technology spillover is really on the data analysis side. So first, I think we're getting a lot more data in a lot of different ways that are going to be essential, especially on the nature-based side. So as we start to think of a world that has connected sensors, it has drone, radar and LiDAR, and satellite coverage that's much more low cost and much more comprehensive than it has been in decades past. We can start to think about actually doing the forest and soil measurement and verification to figure out how the different processes work in a lot more effective and cost-efficient way. I think this could radically transform the economics and really the faith that we have that our nature-based solutions can deliver on the carbon sequestration that they could promise, but today are increasingly imperiled with changes in climate underway and lack of transparency in many of the carbon offset programs that were the initial attempt at these systems. I also think that it's not just technology breakthroughs that are going to get us there, that there's a whole bunch of companies today that are thinking about business model breakthroughs and business model breakthroughs in a whole bunch of different dimensions. I mentioned carbon offsets. There are a number of companies who are thinking about essentially reconceptualizing the carbon offset as a carbon removal credit. Nori is one of these companies working on it initially through soil carbon, thinking about it using the blockchain for verification. Pachama has gotten a ton of great traction coming out of YC a few years ago. They've just sold products to many of the big companies that I mentioned earlier who are looking for nature-based solutions, especially in the forestry sector. But we're also starting to see companies that are thinking about different investment vehicles. So Blue Forest Conservation is selling a very innovative forest conservation bond. We're starting to see companies that are joint developments between private equity and big oil companies like 1.5, a project developer looking to build out some of the early carbon engineering projects. And then we're starting to see a lot of platforms emerge, whether it's groups like Carbon Direct or Carbon Plan. Carbon Plan, actually a nonprofit group in this space, that are really trying to provide a lot more transparency and legitimacy to a lot of the carbon removal products that can come out there. I think what we're seeing is that the whole industry that thought about carbon offsets is going through a bit of a sea change right now. That on one hand, it seems as if this concept of net zero emissions by anywhere from 2030 to 2060 is now the standard for climate action. All of these commitments are net zero, though, and yet the net component of that still remains very, very uncertain and unstandardized. As a result, you have this, it's really a race to figure out what emissions can remain in a zero emission net world and what sort of systems we're going to be using to offset the residual components that end up being too hard. We have almost none of the rules around it, and it feels very much like a Wild West in many ways. It's interesting because this is not the first time that it's felt like a Wild West in the offset space. That 15 years ago, we went through a very similar type of evolution in the ecosystem. We had large exchanges like the Chicago Climate Exchange. We had international agreements try and codify not just voluntary offsets, but compliance ones through the EU ETS, for example. But the field has, it's in many ways internalized a lot of those lessons, and in many cases not, and is still figuring out what it's going to be when it grows up. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty and room for consolidation and improvement across the whole supply chain of carbon offset space. It says it still remains a fairly robust enterprise, and hundreds of millions of tons of voluntary carbon offsets are sold every year. And it's something that, if shifted towards carbon removal and carbon sequestration in a robust way, I think could make a really meaningful difference on moving the needle. And it's really interesting because a group out of Oxford University actually just published a new set of guidelines and principles on carbon offsetting for carbon sequestration. I think really, really strong, and hopefully will help set the field in a much more robust trajectory going forward. The other breakthrough that I think is needed, and I'm actually optimistic about, despite watching that debate last night, is the political climate in DC. That at the end of the day, climate change is something that is increasingly nonpartisan, in that people believe it, even if one party does not. That the overwhelming polling evidence suggests that people care about it and want to do something about it. The problem is that the solutions have been so partisan in many cases that we have a lot of trouble finding the area for common agreement. Carbon removal, and to a certain extent carbon sequestration, has actually avoided that in DC at a small scale. That the fact that the Trump administration signed into law a very large carbon sequestration tax cut as part of the tax reform deal in 2017 is a sign that this is something that can get bipartisan traction. And the fact that carbon sequestration is now part of the Democrats' House Select Committee report on climate change, and it's really integrated within the platform, that I think that there's opportunity to move the politics on carbon capture and sequestration writ large in a way that will early on create the foundation. Now, at the end of the day, this is a waste management industry, that we can figure out utilization, we can figure out co-benefits, but ultimately carbon sequestration is something that we are going to have to pay for. And I think that there's increasing consensus that carbon prices are going to have to be way higher than people had initially thought about way sooner to deal with our climate problem. And I don't expect there to be an economy-wide carbon tax, and I don't expect that anyone should invest in the hopes that there will be anytime soon. But I do expect that there will be a sector by sector carbon pricing regime that does emerge as a mix of state and federal incentives, in the exact same way that we've already seen California offering $200 a ton that stacks with a federal $50 a ton credit. That's essentially a $250 carbon price for carbon capture and sequestration. And that's something that I think is not widely recognized, that even though the idea of a big cap and trade program or a universal carbon tax is far away, this is not. Carbon pricing is here, just in a very patchwork and incomplete way.
Noah, can you explain what we're seeing on the right side of that graph? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So this is from a great analysis that was done by some scholars at Columbia University, which basically said, let's not imagine that we're going to set carbon prices based on this idea of a social cost of carbon, which is the sort of break-even point about the damage done to climate change. They're saying, what if we set carbon prices based on what it would actually take to get the economy to net zero in certain scenarios? And so those scenarios are the different colors. Do we want net zero soon in 2040, later in 2060? What carbon price does it actually take us to get there? And I think the really interesting thing is that across these different scenarios, that carbon price is way higher than what consensus groups have said we need in terms of carbon pricing. That I know that there's been this bipartisan coalition that says let's have a $40 a ton carbon price or so forth. But if you look at the kind of median estimates for what the carbon price is going to be, the number is way higher than that $40 a ton benchmark that has been, I think, a kind of anchor for a lot of the climate and carbon tax community, and is well within the range of what carbon sequestration costs today, not just at high concentration point sources, but once you start thinking about the aggressive scenarios out in 2030 and beyond, direct air capture is certainly well within what carbon prices we should expect to pay.
And the colors there, do they correspond to the years colors on the left?
Yeah, so the red is if we want to hit net zero by 2040, and the green is if we want to hit it by 2060.
And so these are the prices that we need to put carbon at in year 2025 and then in year 2030?
In order to be on that trajectory on the left. Yep. And I think the other piece of this bipartisan hope is that there is increasing consensus that we need innovation spending at a way higher level than we have in the past. That yes, we have a lot of the solutions and we just need to deploy them, but this is another report from a different set of scholars at Columbia University that laid out a handful of technology pillars. And if you look at the bottom half of this, essentially, it's all about different types of carbon sequestration. That there's a huge amount of innovation that needs to happen. The National Academy said it's maybe on the order of $10 to $25 billion over a decade. If you do that well across this portfolio of solutions, you ideally can drive a lot of private sector capital to crowd in and scale those solutions. I do want to flag that this whole carbon sequestration area is something that has lagged behind basically every other piece of the climate innovation puzzle. And a big piece of that is that there's no philanthropy to support the political and research advocacy around the space. And that climate change as a whole is this tiny, tiny sliver of all the philanthropic giving. This is from a Climate Works Foundation report that came out last week. $5 to $9 billion sounds like a lot of money each year. It's less than 2% of all philanthropic giving. It's far, far less than what the oil and gas and the fossil fuel industry spends on lobbying to keep policies entrenched. And that happens through this whole network of systems, including things that aren't necessarily fossil fuel specific, like the Chamber of Commerce. I do want to point out that carbon removal is on this map at the bottom of the slide, this incredibly messy diagram, but about $25 million of the several billion or so from climate foundations has gone to carbon capture and removal. So not only is the pie way too small, but the sliver of that pie going to carbon removal is also way too small. And so there's a huge need for the community to not just deploy their for-profit capital into promising companies, but to support the broader ecosystem to make sure that we can actually create the markets, the technologies, and the policies to create more investment opportunities and to make those pay off. And that is also a very self-serving pitch, because that's what we try and do at Carbon180. And we would love to have your support and to figure out how we can work with you all on that civil society piece to make sure that we can unlock a lot of the potential here. And going back to the beginning, figuring out how we can turn what is an incredibly high promise, but also complex and an uncertain field into something that is the economy of the future. And future generations look back and say, you burned more fossil fuels and you took out of the atmosphere. Like, what were you thinking? And that's just so far away from reality, but it's actually closer than we think if we start to get to work today. So with that, I'll say thank you again. It was great being here with everyone. Thanks to the whole Impact.Tech team, and would love to turn it over to any questions.